Hello and welcome to Betting People. This week we have a very familiar face for you. You will recognise him from the Matchbook podcast and Racing TV, where he is one of the lead presenters and interviewers. It is indeed Tom Stanley. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be asked on. I'm terrified I won't be half as interesting as a lot of people you've had on, but I'll do my very best, Will. And no, thanks for having me on.
It's interesting. Lots of people say that, and then they always turn out to be really interesting guests. We're going to go right back to the start here and ask. You had a very colourful career in racing. How did you get into the sport to start off with?
The one word answer to that is betting. That was my that's what piqued my interest in the sport. So growing up, I had a dad who was really into racing, and it was his. He had a corporate job, but it was his dream to own a racehorse. So I suppose he was my intro, if you like. But when he retired, he did get a racehorse, and it was the only one he ever owned outright. He's been in syndicates subsequently. And it was a horse called Cheval De Guerre, who was trained by Kim Bailey, an association we as a family still have. He was very much a jumps racing fan, my dad, and it won first time out at Warwick, and that was a great experience. Don't get me wrong, but the whole thing didn't really. I never saw myself as anything other than a very casual racing fan until I started betting on horses. I was a young, I remember being sort of, I don't know, maybe 10, 11, 12, and dad having the racing on at home, and me genuinely thinking, why are we watching this? We could be watching. I mean, it sounds terrible that I now work in racing, but we could be watching football. I quite liked my F1 back then for some reason. Back at probably the end of the Damon Hill era, I loved my cricket, and still do love all of those. But at that point, horse racing wasn't my number one at any stage, except really for the Cheltenham Festival, where I'd definitely watch that on the TV. But the Saturday fair, and certainly the day-to-day, was not on my radar until really I hit my sort of late teens and started having a bet. So I mean, that really was Dad's fault, because he introduced me to that, even though he's never had a bet in his life, and still hasn't. So he obviously comes at it from a very different angle. He's a purist who just loves the animal and the sport, and I now love the animal and the sport. But it was betting which really piqued that interest and meant I now work in it. So really, from late teens onwards, the initial goal was to make it as a pro punter for me. And here I am, having not done that, and I'm probably quite glad in the end, because I'm very lucky now to do what I do and love it. But yeah, that was what really made me go, I love horse racing. It was from a betting angle.
I just obviously minded to ask you, what's your first really big betting memory? Was it a Grand National or a Cheltenham Festival or something completely different?
My first really big betting memory, I can't give you the date, and I really should, but it was the Cheltenham Festival, Friday of the Cheltenham Festival, when Penzance won for Alan King.
Penzance.
And I had that and the Gold Cup winner in a double that day. And I just had a really good betting day. I was there with my dad, actually. And that was the first time I thought, I can make this work. I want to say that was, I'm going to get this so wrong now, aren't I? I want to say that was the early noughties. I want to say it was probably about 2003, 4, 5, something like that. It was one or those. Maybe you can tell me.
Feels right.
Yeah. And that was the time, because I would have been, sort of knocking on early 20s then, and that was the first time I thought, this is it. I'm going to make this pay. Obviously, this is it. I'm going to get stuck into the day-to-day, not just the Saturday punting, and pay for my way through university by betting on horses. I'm not going to get a summer job. I'm going to back horses for a living. This is great. That was the first really big, good day where, as a young guy, you come home with lots of cash and you go, this is it. This is what it's all about.
Absolutely. I'm sure many people watching will be familiar with that feeling. Were there any punting lessons actually that you learned from the early days? Because you went on to be a tipster for odds checker. You've been betting on horses for a long time now. What did you do early on that you would encourage people who maybe just starting out or who are even betting now not to do?
All right. So the way I started making money initially, and I did it relatively successfully, you couldn't do now. So I'm I'm a matchbook ambassador who was about to mention Betfair, but in the early days that was the exchange. So I can't skirt around that. So what I would do is follow. I mean, it wasn't based on form study at all. It was basically a follow the money move, whereby again, early noughties time, you could quite easily. So if I try and pinpoint where I was, I'd say certainly my last year university, 06, 07, those couple of years it would have been, you could see what was being backed in the morning on Betfair, because in those days there was a good amount of liquidity in the mornings on the exchange. There really was only one then. And I would subsequently go on. I had about 5 or 6 bookie accounts, the main ones, and I wasn't arbing because I wasn't laying at all. I was just following those morning moves, and I was backing horses at bigger prices with bookmakers, and I could do it for a good few months with the bookmaker before it became an issue. It was a case of I didn't know the horse's relative chances at the time, really, because again, even around then, the day-to-day racing was, I was interested in it, but I didn't follow the form concretely enough. A class 5 handicap at Southwell wasn't something I would follow the form with. But if a horse was being backed in that race, I'd back it at 2 or 3 points bigger sometimes before the bookmaker cottoned on to the move. And the horse's relative chance doesn't really matter at that point, because you're getting the value about it. And if you manage to do that with, I was probably backing 20 to 30 horses a day. And when you're getting that many horses on side at value, you need a few of them to go in over a consistent period of time, and you'll end up making money. So it wasn't big amounts, but again, for me then, supporting me through my last year of uni, it was a good bit of extra cash. That was great. But after that, it became pretty clear that you couldn't do that anymore, and the bookmakers were reacting to the exchange move, and so far too quickly for me to do anything about it, or to get on at the bigger price, and it became frustrating. And then I had to just change tack completely and get stuck into form study.
Fair enough. I was going to ask actually what you did when bookmakers cottoned on. Actually, just going back to market movers, do you still see them as a particularly effective way to sort of maybe cotton on to horses who have a better chance, who might be overpriced, or do you think that day is truly done? Because we have market movers pages at Star. They're on all TV channels, ITV, Racing TV, Sky Sports Racing. Would you say they're still a good signifier, especially in sort of the sort of contests you were making money from earlier on? Or
they're a good signifier of a horse's chance, but a horse's a horse's chance isn't gonna over a long period make you money. It's value which is. You and I, just to simplify it, obviously, you and I could back the same horses at different times, and you make money and I don't, because you've got on before the horse has become a market mover. Once a horse is a market mover, the value's gone, right? Well, most of the time. So it might be a good signifier of a horse's chance, and you could go through on the odds checker page, for example, and find out all the big market movers and back all of them one Sunday afternoon, and you might make money. But if you do it over a long period, you're just backing market movers, where ultimately the value is almost all eroded, unless it's a ridiculous de real deal-esque market mover where get on at any price you like until 2 o'clock and it's value. Then you're behind the times. So I had to stop doing that, because I no longer had an edge. I'd spend a few months doing it with a bookmaker, and then it would become probably quite obvious what I was doing, and then I'd have to move on to another one. And over the period of a year and a bit, it was great, but it wasn't going to make me a lot of money, and B, it became unsustainable when the when there wasn't such a time gap between the early morning exchange mover and the bookmaker reacting.
You talked about your form reading, which is something obviously you've been doing for a long time. What are the most important variables when you look at any typical race? I know that this will change depending on jurisdiction and depending on sort of time, but are there any certain elements of a race that you think this is really important? I got to know this before I start pricing up a tissue or whatever.
I think that eliminating variables is the most useful tool. So without a doubt, the most successful period I had was for about a year and a half, 2 years. And bearing in mind now, my Kempton betting is terrible. But for about a year and a half, 2 years, I focused on class 4 handicaps or better at Kempton. Always handicaps, and on the outer course. And that way you're at a time where it was never standard to slow either. It was always standard. And at that point, you're eliminating lots of variables. You're focusing on one track. You know, Southall, for example, was a track I just never really punted and don't. But Kempton, the all-weather is something where you don't have to take into account whether it's good ground or soft ground or heavy ground or tacky ground or holding ground, whether they're getting through it or not. All of these things, which can get really confusing. And quite often, certainly back then, you had similar horses running against each other. And once you've worked out the pace scenario, I found, you found it much easier to eliminate horses by taking out those variables. So I suppose the roundabout way to answer your question is, if I am going on turf betting, then the ground is probably the place to start. And sometimes if I'm being lazy, if I've got to do something, you know, if I've got to, not necessarily from a betting angle, if I've got to do a quick bit of study on a race, which sometimes happens if I worked a late shift for racing TV and then I'm working again the following afternoon, I'll have to just spend a little bit less time prepping. If I'm trying to work out what's going to happen in the race, I start with the pace, because that can give you a good idea of how a race is likely to unfold.
On that last note, pace, which is something we've talked about on Betting People before. We talked to Simon Rowlands about it. We talked to many other punters about it. Do you think that, by and large, in this country, we have enough information on things such as pace? I know that people make their own ties and ratings. I was wondering actually if you do that. But some courses have sectionals, others it seems to be a bit iffy. Do we still have some way to go before you could do it in the same way you could in America, for instance, where every quarter's timed, or say Hong Kong or Australia, for instance?
We definitely have a way to go. I mean, Simon Rowlands is great at banging this drum because it is a drum that has to be banged. And he is, you know, I can't profess to be 10% as knowledgeable about the subject as he is, but we haven't even gone half the way, and we've got to go the full way. You know, I'm pleased to say with Racing TV, for example, now all UK racing, we have the course tracks timings on there, and we've just started to implement the sectionals with Angus analysing them at Angus McNay, analysing them at Kempton, which is essential. You know, we need to know. So something I learned from Dubai, for example, is when I'm out there, when we're out there on the screen, we have all the sectionals come up. So the first year I spent out there, I'm ashamed to say, which is 5 years ago now, the first 400-meter sectional time would come up, and I wouldn't even look at it. It's just considering where I am now, I wouldn't. I was so worried about. I mean, I had A4 pages of notes on every horse's bit of form and everything, because the role I was doing out there was sort of presenter and pundit, and I don't want to look stupid. Fine. But if you can say after the race, instead of going to the jockey and saying, because quite often you put the microphone in front of the jockey's face, and you go, "What sort of pace do you feel you went?" "Yeah, steady," and they haven't. They've gone quick. Because if you're riding in a race like that, I suppose you're not always going to know, right? It's all relative. You put your horse relative to where he wants to be, and you know, if it's worked out, you might reflect as a rider and think that it's gone to plan based on how you thought the race was going to pan out. But the times are what gives us the exact answer as to how a race was run. And if we work on 12-second furlongs, you know that if a horse has gone. Capizano was a prime example the other day in Dubai 2 weeks ago, where I backed him for round 1 of the Amaktoum Challenge, because I thought he'd definitely win, but I thought he'd trade shorter in the run because he'd get to the front, which he did, and he would be a good back to lay, basically, if I didn't think he was going to win. And he did like a 23-second first 400 meters, first 2 furlongs. I mean, that's curtains. No matter how quick the dirt's riding, he was a goner. And that sort of information, if you as a punter can process that straight away and see, oh, well, he's just definitely gone too quick, you should be, I think, be able to identify that straight away, really. And that's what sectionals can do. And before having the clock on the screen, is like I say, as we now do on Racing TV, which is great, you couldn't do that. And the other thing is, somebody wrote to me a message the other day talking about sectionals and talking about jump racing, and saying how he wouldn't put any value in sectionals in jump racing. And again, that's probably a view I had 5 years ago, but now I know it's probably not as strict because of you don't come out the stalls, etc.
Yeah.
And they can, they might be over 3 miles, they might just be cantering for a little bit, but galloping, but not very quick. But realistically, it still tells the story of the race, and it still has to be seen as incredibly important, I think, sectionals in jump racing, because it can tell you why a horse might have folded or why a horse might have kept going at the end of the race.
I think that's a really great way to end a fascinating part 1 of Betting People. Thank you for your time, Tom Stanley, and come back tomorrow for part 2.